So Wendy, we're going to talk about what we think are the benefits, or what we've seen are the benefits of using ePortfolios in our teaching and in our students' learning. What do you reckon? What happens with you?
I think for me, the biggest thing, the most valuable thing is the fact that they have all of their bits together and that we build on them, and that as they're building on them, they can actually look back at what they've done and where they've come from. So that real reflection on their progress and their development, I think, is the most important thing that I've found.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, and that there's a sense of longitudinal.
Yes,
collation.
and they forget. They're busy. They've got, as music students, they've got multiple lives. They're performers and they're students and they're community musicians, and every now and again they come back together and they look back. Oh yeah, as a teacher and as this person I am here, I started from here and that was what I thought last year, and after all this that I've learned, now I can see that it's changing into something a little bit different.
But I think that when you list the professional identities or their musical identities, that to me is also really important, and something that the students have talked about, that they can show that they're a teacher, they can show that they're a performer, they can show that they compose, they can show they play in a band, they can show that they work in a community or in a therapy setting, that they've got all these different identities, and an ePortfolio allows them to put in an example of each one of those. So if they're applying for a job or a grant or postgraduate study or whatever, or just even to make an identity statement about themselves.
I think too, if they do want to apply for a job or something, that if they use their portfolio well, then they can choose which part of that identity they want to show, or which one of those identities they want to share, but not necessarily divulge the whole lot.
And I found also when I talked to students about that, they would say, "Oh, I didn't realise until I had to do that I have all these identities." They assume that as a musician, everybody does that you move in and out of being an accompanist, being a performer, and that doing the ePortfolio was a way of making that explicit. Yeah. So that would be something that I would put into teaching when working on this idea of multiple identities for music students, music education students, is that you could use an ePortfolio to actually teach that. What do you reckon?
I think you could.
I mean, similarly, the whole idea of the 4 or 5 year period, 3, 4, 5 year period of a degree, you could make it explicit through teaching that an ePortfolio is a way of recording all of that as a reflection.
I think ideally that would work ideally if it were used across all of those different areas in their lives as well. So I think, here we're using them in education and music education subjects. I think if they were using them as part of their musicology, or if they were using them in their composition, I think then they would perhaps see the benefits of that more easily, and perhaps they could look across those, and perhaps we as teachers looking at their ePortfolios would also understand more about who these people were, and what else they do in their lives, and what are they bringing to teaching, what are they bringing to their learning in our units of study. I think would be a really useful thing as well.
Yeah. I think it's also important that through an ePortfolio, when we're teaching the role of technology in education, so the technologising of education, which is something that we teach about, that an ePortfolio acts as a really good example of how these things work in a classroom or in any sort of teaching and learning situation. And it also demonstrates the skills that students need to have and to develop and think about, and that these are ongoing. And you have to keep on updating your technology skills.
And I think for those students who've been out in schools, in their classrooms, to any extent, and they're seeing how classroom teachers work with their students, they're also seeing ePortfolios as a potential tool to use in a classroom for the students, even for younger students who are quite adept with technology.
Yeah, and I quite often found that when students came back from practice teaching sessions, the interest in ePortfolios would increase because they'd say, I was in a classroom and it was all electronically delivered.
Yes.
So that's what the school was expecting and what the students were expecting. And I realise now that I have to actually work on this and learn to do it and be good at it.
I think the other thing that they're seeing in their practice teaching is they're seeing themselves more as potential teachers who have to go and do an interview and prove themselves, if you like, and that the ePortfolio then is a tool where they can gather bits and pieces about them, whether it's evidence of teaching standards or whether it's about their composition and their performance and their studies, their academic studies, so that they have something to present to the principal or the interviewing body in much the same way that school children's ePortfolios are taken home and showed to their parents. So.
I think what's really helpful is that it changes teaching dramatically, and it makes a teaching staff member who's got an open mind, mind you, because there are people who don't see it this way, that it actually forces you to rethink how you teach, what you teach and why you're doing it and what the outcome is going to be. And I think one of the biggest problems in education, particularly in universities and colleges, but not so much in schools, is that a lot of staff members have not made that leap of teaching having to change to match the learning that's going on, because students learn differently through IT-assisted contexts. And the reason I don't think the big problem exists so much in high schools and primary schools is because kids at that age keep the teachers on their toes, and the teachers have to respond to what's happening. Whereas in lots of universities, you get a lot of staff members who do the same thing year after year after year and don't really think about moving ahead. And I think there's a real disjuncture in university education worldwide because of this. And I would say in 10 years' time, that won't happen. The teachers will have moved on, new teachers will have come through, and this will now be normal. So I think it's actually having a big role in the development of teaching practice and ideology. What do you think?
I agree. I think I'm surprised that many of our students aren't more confident in their use of technology. And I do think, as a teacher, then it's up to us to show them how to do it. So that's been quite a challenge because I had to learn how to use it myself so I could show them. It's also been important to bring in some peer teaching there, because it's really interesting that within a group of 20 students, you'll find one who just grabs it and runs with it and can do it. And I think that whole peer tutoring is really valuable then too. And I think the students feel great if they can show the teacher how to do something. And that's really valuable. That's a really important thing for the dynamics of the group.
But do you find that as each year goes ahead, the students who are coming in are actually more or are better equipped technologically? Because years ago we actually had to teach the basics of computer usage, and now of course we don't do that. We expect a certain level. So I think there's a gradual upping of skills.
I think we assume that most of them have probably as good as we do.
And also the technology has improved. It's so much easier to film on your phone and to edit and to upload it to your whatever, your website, your ePortfolio, your Facebook page, whatever you're using, your PowerPoint. Whereas even less than 10 years ago, that was a really complex process, and you had to know all the editing skills and all the commands. But the smartphone has
everything
changed. And didn't you say that there's now an app for PebblePad?
An app for PebblePad?
Where you take everything on your phone and then you use the PebblePad app to upload. And why not?
Does that for most things, I think.
Indeed. Yeah, I think that's really clever. Yeah. I think it's really interesting that in music education, because we focus on pedagogy and on teaching and learning and thinking about it, I think we actually are quite up to the mark in that sort of thinking. But I think there are other disciplines across universities that still have not really come to that, because the need is not pushing them. You can still get by with paper-based materials, whereas we want our students to be able to go into schools and use this sort of technology for many, many reasons, mechanical as much as ideological, as much as pedagogical.
I think my perception coming recently into university is that, and coming from school staffs, where school staffs work on the same timetable, as a general rule, everyone's in the classroom at the same time, then they're in the staff room at the same time, then they're on bus duty at the same time. So there's lots of conversation about all sorts of things. My perception with coming into university is that with such different timetabling, I can go days and not see another staff member. So for me, that's meant, I guess, for me personally, that yes, I've taken on board, the reading and doing these things, but it's very easy to see how people can be left behind if they're not involved, if they're just turning up and doing their teaching, and they're not looking across. I mean, we're quite small here, but in a bigger university where there are lots of people in a school, I think it's very easy to get left behind and not to see what's happening in other people's, not to see that ePortfolio is being used there. So why don't we try that? Because it's a working in a much more insular area.
And I think that different universities have very different policies and practices on training.
Yes.
That there are some universities who consciously teach their staff how to use various forms of technology, not just ePortfolios. And there are other universities where you're just left to your own devices.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And then again, there's all the problems, of course, of which platform you're going to use and who's going to make that decision, and whether it's going to be free, a public free access, or it's going to be paid for by licence. All of those issues come into it as well. And that, of course, influences teaching, because the software and the infrastructure changes what you do and how you do it and what your expectations are and how the students will interact with it.
I think one of the really important things as a teacher is the capacity to offer feedback through the ePortfolio as well, depending again on platform. But as I said earlier, that they have their earlier assignments or work, whatever they've done, housed in the ePortfolio. I think having teacher feedback housed there with that is also a really valuable thing, that I think sometimes, they get an assignment back or whatever and they look at the mark and there it is and that was it. Whereas again, if they're coming back and they're seeing, last year when I wrote my teaching philosophy or whatever I did, I got these comments and they're still there. So the comments are still there with the work as well. I think that's an important thing for teaching as well.
But I think that changes the ways that people are learning then. Yes. Because if you are considering a returned assignment with a red mark on the bottom and that's at the end of the year and that's it, and you never look back at it, which I think is what a lot of students used to do and probably still do. Whereas if you've got an ongoing electronic record of it, there is the possibility that you will start to look backwards and forwards at your marks and your potential to develop. So I think it's that's changing so many things. It's changing the face of education really rapidly. But that's in step with changes to daily life.
Yes.
Because everybody lives now with their device.
Absolutely.
And I find that if I'm somewhere without Wi-Fi, I get really tetchy. It's just like...
And so do the students.
Yes, I know. Yeah. I mean, it's part of a jigsaw of all sorts of other issues. And it's difficult to take it out and talk about it separately from everything.